November 22, 1910, Hoboken, New Jersey. A private rail car sits in the shadows. Senator Nelson Aldrich and 5 of the world's most powerful bankers board under the cover of darkness. They use fake names, Orton, May, and Ward, to avoid tip-offs to the press. If the American public knew the money trust was meeting in secret, there would be a second revolution. They're heading 800 miles south to a place where no one can hear them. Why the secrecy? 3 years earlier, the Panic of 1907 nearly destroyed the U.S. economy. There was no central bank. People rioted outside banks to get their savings. J.P. Morgan had to personally lock bankers in his library to force a bailout. The elite realized that relying on one old man's ego wasn't a business plan. They needed a lender of last resort, but the public hated the idea of a central bank controlled by Wall Street. Jekyll Island, Georgia. At the time, it was the most exclusive club on Earth. Members included the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts. To the outside world, this was a duck hunting trip. But for 10 days, these 6 men, representing 25% of the world's wealth, were isolated. They stayed in a clubhouse with no telephones and no contact with the outside world. This was the laboratory where the modern dollar would be engineered. The EU connection. The brain of the operation wasn't American. It was Paul Warburg, a brilliant German-born banker from the Kuhn, Loeb & Co. dynasty. Warburg understood the European central bank model, like the Bank of England. He spent the week teaching the American politicians how to disguise a private banking cartel as a public government entity. He was the professor, and the U.S. senators were his students. The man behind the Jekyll Island plan faced a problem. Americans distrusted big government and centralized banks. A single national bank, especially in New York, would never pass. Their solution was to appear decentralized. They created a system of 12 regional Federal Reserve districts, making it seem like financial power was spread across the country. This satisfied public demands for states' rights and local control. In reality, real authority rested with a central board in Washington, D.C., which set national monetary policy. The system looked regional but functioned centrally. Decentralized in form, centralized in power. The original plan for America's central bank was called the Aldrich Plan, named after Senator Nelson Aldrich. Economically, it worked, but politically, it failed. Aldrich was closely linked to Wall Street and the feared money trust, so the plan looked like a takeover by bankers. Congress rejected it. After Woodrow Wilson won the presidency in 1912, the strategy shifted. The plan wasn't scrapped, it was rebranded. Aldrich's name was removed, banker-heavy language was softened, and the proposal was renamed the Federal Reserve Act. The word federal was crucial. It made the system sound public, national, and accountable, even though private banks still played a major role. Structurally, the core idea stayed the same, a centralized system presented as decentralized. This was one of the most effective political marketing pivots in financial history. Lawmakers who rejected the Aldrich Plan accepted the Federal Reserve. The lesson for both U.S. and EU audiences: the power structure barely changed, the packaging did. In December 1913, timing did the heavy lifting. As Congress prepared to leave Washington for the Christmas holidays, many lawmakers had already gone home. In that quiet window, the Federal Reserve Act was brought to a vote. With a thin, exhausted House and Senate, the bill passed quickly and with little public attention. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law immediately. What had been secretly designed years earlier was now official U.S. policy. This moment is often called the end of the Jekyll Island secret. The financial system planned behind closed doors had become the law of the land. Under the new system, the U.S. government no longer issued currency directly. Money would be created through the Federal Reserve System. The government would borrow that money at interest. Supporters saw this as stabilizing a fragile financial system. Critics saw it as a historic transfer of power, placing control of the nation's money supply into a system heavily influenced by private banks. Either way, 1913 marked a turning point in modern American and global finance. Since that secret meeting in 1910, the U.S. dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power. What once bought a full basket of goods now barely buys a fraction of it. Over the last century, the U.S. economy has lurched through repeated boom and bust cycles. The Great Depression, the runaway inflation of the 1970s, the 2008 financial crash. Each crisis was different, but they all unfolded under the same monetary system created after Jekyll Island. Supporters argued the Federal Reserve was designed to stabilize the economy, prevent bank runs, and smooth out cycles. Critics argue something darker, that it socialized risk, protecting major banks from catastrophic losses while ordinary people paid the price through inflation, debt, and bailouts. So what was the Fed really built to do? Stabilize the system, or shield its architects from failure? The answer, many believe, doesn't lie in public hearings or textbooks, but in the shadows of a quiet Georgian island where the modern financial world was born. The mechanism. This chapter explains the technical magic Paul Warburg brought from Europe. Before the Fed, the money supply was tied to gold. It was rigid. The Jekyll Island Group wanted an elastic currency. This meant the bank could expand the money supply during crises and contract it later. In simple terms, they gained the power to create money out of thin air. For the audience, this is the light bulb moment where they realize the dollar shifted from a receipt for gold to a tool of debt. How Jekyll Island reshaped the world. The Jekyll Island plan didn't just transform the United States. It plugged America into a global financial system that already existed, one dominated by powerful central banks in London, Paris, and Berlin. Before 1913, the U.S. stood somewhat apart. It had no permanent central bank and limited ability to coordinate large-scale international finance. After the Federal Reserve was created, that changed almost overnight. America now had a central monetary authority that could expand credit, issue currency, and cooperate with other central banks on a scale never seen before. To supporters, this was progress. To critics, it was the birth of a central bank cartel, a small network of institutions capable of creating vast sums of money and directing it towards governments and wars. This mattered immediately. Just months after the Fed opened its doors, World War I erupted in Europe. The war demanded resources on an unimaginable scale: weapons, factories, railroads, food, and soldiers. Traditional taxation couldn't come close to paying for it. What made the war financially possible, many argue, was central bank-enabled debt. With the Fed in place, the United States could print and lend billions of dollars, finance allied governments, integrate U.S. banking with European war finance. The war didn't just drain nations, it reshaped Europe, collapsed empires, and redrew borders. And it set a precedent. Modern wars would no longer be limited by gold or savings, but by how much debt central banks could support. Whether you see this system as necessary or dangerous, one thing is clear. After Jekyll Island, finance became global, centralized, and powerful enough to change the course of history itself. And once that door was opened, it was never closed again. The setup. With the new system in place, the 1920s became a playground for the Jekyll Island architects. They lowered interest rates and flooded the market with cheap money, fueling the roaring 20s. But this was a trap. This chapter details how the Fed's early policies created the massive bubble that inevitably led to the 1929 crash. It challenges the viewer. Was the Great Depression a failure of the Fed, or was it the inevitable bust following their engineered boom? The modern mirror. We return to Jekyll Island in the present day. The clubhouse is now a luxury hotel, and tourists walk the halls where the world's fate was decided. This chapter serves as the philosophy section. We compare the 1910 meeting to modern-day summits like Davos or the G7. It asks the audience, has anything actually changed? Or are the first-name-only meetings still happening today behind closed doors? It leaves the viewer with a sense of lingering mystery and healthy skepticism. For years, the bankers denied the meeting ever happened. They called it populist fantasy. But once the Federal Reserve was firmly established and the statute of limitations on their secrecy had passed, the egos of the architects got the better of them. They wanted credit for their masterpiece. 25 years later, Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, now Citibank, and one of the original six, wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post. He didn't just admit to the meeting, he bragged about it. I was as furtive, as stealthy as any conspirator. If it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress.